Hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Again, our guest today is Nicole Tschierske. She is a scientist and a positive psychology coach who helps experts and teams in STEM fields do better work. So she works with her clients to improve their collaboration and communication skills so their work gets the momentum and recognition it deserves. Nicole also helps construct ways of working that reduce stress, increase motivation and engagement, and deliver results. So lean is a part of her experience, and we're going to be talking about all of that today. So before I tell you a little bit more about Nicole, first off, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm really glad of spending my Friday evening with you, Mark.
Yes. So Nicole, thank you for that. Nicole is joining us from Hamburg, Germany. So it's morning here in Los Angeles, evening in Germany. Nicole holds a PhD in chemistry, and she's trained in coaching, positive psychology, change management, and advanced problem solving. And as her bio says, when she's not buried in research papers and books, you can find her taking long hikes in the German countryside. That sounds great. And she's being mesmerized by Mary Poppins on the screen. So I have not seen Mary. I go for hikes. I have not seen Mary Poppins in a long time. Is there a particular song or just the whole Mary Poppins story and film that appeals to you?
It's more her as a character and how she assumes her role. And I take her as a role model for the work that I do with clients. Well, not that I can do literal magic, but at least we can try and make things fun and engaging while we work on very serious growth and development and delivering results, but also allowing people to be on their own journey, helping them out as a guide, helping them to reflect and understand, to look at what are we actually doing here, but without dictating to them how things should be done. And, so one day I will write a whole essay about the leadership lessons we can learn from Mary Poppins.
Yeah, that sounds fun. That'd be something to look forward to and a unique topic to explore. So, Nicole, your background and your experiences are unique, I think, compared to a lot of people who've been on the podcast who are talking about manufacturing or healthcare processes. We have a chance today to talk about, your work in areas like, research. And so I'd like to hear your story. We always ask guests here, how and where, what was the context when you were first introduced to lean?
Yeah. Lean was how do you say that in English, that when someone has a heart attack and you revitalize them with that electrical shock?
The paddles, the
so it was kind of like, it felt like that moment of being brought back to life, because I was put into a lean working group in the company where I worked after I had a severe case of bore-out. Without going into the whole sob story of this, but it was for about 1.5 years. I was working only to 10% of my capacity in a product research team, and that was towards the end. It was unbearable because I do like working and I like adding value and I like being busy, and so that was horrible. And so I went to my HR responsible person and said, look, it's like this has been going on for too long. I've tried everything in my function to create a change. Nothing is happening. Please give me something to do. There must be other parts in the company where people need help, or I really need to go and find something new elsewhere. And at that time in the supply chain area, so I was in science and I had never had anything to do with supply chain before. As it often is when the company has a certain size, you never really get in touch with the other functions. In that area, they were just starting out implementing lean. They had a pilot program where they had brought in external consultants to familiarize and guide through using the methodology to improve ways of working and processes using those tools. At the same time, they also wanted to train the workforce in the mindset, in applying the tools, in how useful it can be to just pause and think and look out and use a systematic way of going and improving our work. And so that's where they put me. And I don't know, I caught fire. I can be very enthusiastic about those things. But so I participated in a trainer training. So it was the first time I learned about lean, in order to then go on and teach to others. At the same time, I could work within that pilot program in supply chain, facilitating the workshops, and because we had those experienced facilitators from outside who were also mentors to me. Then I started to really see what it can do. And businesses often get very excited about the, let's say, ROI opportunities of how many hours or how much money we can save, how much we can improve our quality. But what got me was how collaborative and engaging that approach is, in terms of really working together. And it's not one know-it-all who dictates how things should be done to all the others, but you really harness the ideas and the efforts from so many people cross-functionally. That's another thing that is commonly known in businesses, that silo thinking is a bit of an issue, where you really don't, left hand doesn't know what the right hand does. And working in those lean improvement projects where you really bring all the people together, that just created a really nice atmosphere. And
And I was, before kind of exploring that a little bit further, I was going to go back to what I meant to also share up front at the beginning of the episode. I got sidetracked asking you about Mary Poppins. I was also going to mention, in terms of introductions, that Nicole is the host of a new podcast called Better Work. And Nicole was kind enough to have me on recently as her first guest. So thank you again for doing that, Nicole.
Well, thank you for coming on and, not knowing what you get into, because it was the first episode.
I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes, and I hope people will go check out Nicole's podcast more generally, and subscribe or follow or check that out. And again, there'll be a link in the show notes. Nicole's website is NicoleTschierske.com, and hope people go check that out and learn more about Nicole and her work. So I think it's interesting to hear, your story. It sounds like it was a little bit energizing to move across silos from product research into supply chain, new challenges, new opportunity. But then it sounds like that lean piece was even more energizing in that style. And you mentioned workshops, improvement events, or sometimes people would call those Kaizen events. That's what you're referring to. Yeah.
We had a ton of rapid improvement events, typically about a week long. At that time, in that pilot project in supply chain, I went then on to facilitate similar rapid improvement events, not always a week long, sometimes because a week is a huge commitment for a department or for a business to take people out of the operational business for that long. So I would then go on and facilitate in the laboratory area or in other science and reporting areas, some in finance, to, even if it's 2.5 days, you can get a lot done. And I guess what resonates with that approach so much for me is, I'm a scientist by training and by heart. I like things being structured and rigorous. Note, it's not rigid, but it is rigorous, being analytical instead of judgmental. And the lean framework or the A3 problem solving, which is really, which is the underlying flow of such a rapid improvement event, that it is a method and it takes you step by step by step, and it prevents you from moving too fast or jumping to conclusions or even jumping at causes that you think are the source of the issue. And we spoke about that in our episode, when in fact you might, if you act too hastily, or if you just get all caught up in the excitement of trying to find a solution before you first truly understood what the problem is, then you might solve the wrong problem. So you might have a solution and you have spent all of the time, but nothing gets any better because you didn't solve the right problem. So having this methodology, having something to lean on, no pun intended, but, and following this, you have to trust the process. And that is what I learned as a scientist in terms of how I do research and how I did product innovation, new product development in consumer goods. And this is also what I followed in Lean. It's also what we do in coaching. When coaching people, you follow a certain process, and it gives you a framework, guardrails almost, without being constrictive. So within there is still a lot of freedom.
I love how you explained that phrase, rigorous but not rigid. Like what would be an example? I don't know if you ran across this or if you always managed to prevent the lean improvement process from becoming too rigid. Like, can you think of an example of what would be too rigid?
Yeah. So let's say you start off with your problem statement, you start to do your current state analysis, you start to set your goals, that's all fine. And then typically, if you have a, let's say, typical problem. So a problem is whenever the is deviates from the should. Yeah. So, and we can't explain why. And then you need to do some digging, and you need to do analytics in terms of finding the causes. So then you would go into a brainstorming, and you would maybe use a fishbone diagram to just capture as many of the contributors or potential contributors to the problem. And then you would pick the most impacting ones from them, and you would go into doing a 5 why. And then based on that, the root causes you uncover there, you would go into developing and testing solutions. So if I would insist on, in every project, we have to do a fishbone analysis, in every project we have to do a 5 why, sometimes these tools are not applicable. It's still valid to have that pre-work to then do some proper analysis, but it doesn't mean that you always have to use those tools. So sometimes doing a situation analysis, as Kepner-Trego teaches it, then that is more appropriate than doing those typical other tools.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful with, always or never. I mean, you make some really good points. I think part of being rigorous would be never start with a solution statement.
Yes.
I think that's a fair never. If there's such an obvious thing that just needs to be implemented, don't do a Kaizen event. Just go do the thing. That's probably not ideal. I mean, we go and do something, like you said, we need to evaluate and we need to study the effect. Did we get the results that we would have predicted? And then if not, adjust accordingly instead of just implementing things and assuming that they're good. I think one example of too rigid, I quite often have heard people say, you're starting with lean, you should always start with 5S. And I would challenge that, and Nicole raised an eyebrow for those who are just listening, and now she's laughing, and that's, I think, because of Zoom, that sound isn't coming through. But I think that could be a trap even in manufacturing. I mean, 5S, I'm not saying 5S isn't helpful, But I don't know if it's, always start with 5S. And I think when we start moving across into other industries and other settings, if you're working with a finance team or a product research team, I would really then question the assertion, always start with 5S. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I would use whatever method is appropriate to alleviate the biggest pain that is in front of us now. So maybe in your product innovation team, your shared drive could deserve a 5S workshop, because nobody can find any files anymore. Everything is everywhere and in duplicates. And so maybe that's worth it. But if the problem or the biggest pain that you have to alleviate right now is finding out why that the product formula that works so well in the lab causes a ton of problems when you start to scale it up in the manufacturing environment, then maybe focus on that first. So that's how I would approach it.
Yeah, I always think back to Taiichi Ono from Toyota. In his Toyota Production System book, there's a chapter where the header just says, start from need. It's like, what are the needs of the business? What are the needs for flow? You're describing, and I think we'll get to hear more about this, breaking down the silos and the handoffs from research to product development to scaling to production and supply chain. And then Ono also said, in that chapter, start with your most pressing needs. So I think, we have to prioritize of all the things that we could go and work on. I think there is something to be said for prioritizing based on customer need, business need, team member needs.
Yes, absolutely. The outcome of doing such a work or doing such a project should always be a win for everybody. So win for myself, win for the customer, win for the business. And if it's only for myself or I only do it for the sake of doing it, then what's the point?
Yeah. I mean, we want it to be good for the team members, for sure. So, there are so many connections we can make in terms of benefits for lean and improvement work. Thinking again, to the people, to the employees, you mentioned earlier being worn out, burned out in your previous role, which is, it happens. It's always sad to hear about. I've felt that at times myself in my career. But you've got some thoughts on how lean can help address workplace stress and burnout, not just recovering from it, but because we always talk about preventing harm, preventing defects. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So if you think about any job, and this can be an office role, it can be in a lab, it can be on the shop floor. Every job has aspects to it that either are demands on us, so things that need our sustained effort and energy to cope with them. Those are what scientists call job demands. And every job has aspects that are resources to us, that help us getting things done, that help us be motivated and engaged. And so there are these two, they're not really on a balance, but there are two separate but simultaneously active processes within ourselves. And so those job demands, they can be physical, they can be organizational, they can be cognitive or emotional things about the way how our work has to be done or our work environment that need our constant energy in order to cope with them and to deal with them. And for example, if we think about physical, if you work in an environment that is really loud and you you know that in a manufacturing environment, when you then have the protective gear to shield you from the noise, but you can also think about that in an open office when you have a bunch of people around you being on calls at the same time, and the noise level is just, you might not notice it at first, but if you have that the whole day, it takes you that extra much of effort to concentrate on doing what you're doing or to just listen to whoever is on your phone. So it's things like that, or it can be the amount of work that you have to do, the complexity of your tasks, emotional demands if you have to deal with difficult stakeholders, if there's problem at handover points in processes, or upset customers when you work in a call center. It can also be other obstacles in about how work is structured. So are roles and responsibilities not clear, for example, or is there a ton of bureaucracy? So all of those things, they happen, they are normal, but they cost us really a lot of effort. And when you pair this with not being able to recover from spending all that energy, then over time you get into a sort of loss spiral because you have to cope with them. You have no way to replenish yourself. And if you take it to the extreme, or if this goes on for too long, then this can really result in, raised stress levels. Mm-hmm. It can result in impaired health, sleeping problems. It is definitely one component of burnout, having this complete exhaustion just from having to deal with how work is organized. And you probably already heard a number of things where you say, oh yeah, this is where we do, what we address with lean. For example, when the workload is too high, or if there's a ton of bureaucracy, why do we not have a look at how the process flows? Where is variation coming from that's not necessary? Is all the work that we do truly value adding, or could we just skip something? So really using lean tools and the approach, or even just the philosophy of really looking for how can we make work better in order to feel better. And that is kind of like where it's coming from.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And there are connections between stress, mental stress, emotional stress, and physical health. Mm-hmm. So there are clear, important connections of not just focusing on acute injuries.
Yes.
So I think of parallels to healthcare settings, nurses in a hospital using your model. They're facing physical demands. There's the risk of injury from having to reposition a patient, and let's say if they don't have the proper assists and equipment. Mm-hmm. And they're pressured for different reasons, time pressure and different demands. Maybe this is now as some of the cognitive demand, but then they're pressured into doing the work in an unsafe way. There's physical injury. There's a question around, it's very typical for nurses to work 12-hour shifts, but there's a lot of evidence that shows the number of errors start increasing in the 11th and 12th hours of the shift. So there's cognitive overload combined with physical overload of nurses often not being able to take proper breaks. They're on their feet all day. They're racing around. They may have the emotional demands, especially in COVID times, of more patients being very sick and dying, and having to say, you still have work to do, right? There are all these interconnected issues that cause stress and burnout and people leaving a job. But the final thing I was going to say, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, is I think lean gives us ways and mindsets of getting more to the root causes of this overburden, physical, cognitive, or emotional overburden, as opposed to trying to paper over the harm, or sending people to resilience training is very popular, at least here in the US. I don't know if that happens in Germany, but I think the countermeasure of sending an employee to resilience training is almost blaming them for not dealing with the overload when we should instead be improving the system in a way that reduces those overloads and demands.
Yeah. So, yes, to everything that you said, I would say if you have a good type of resilience training, then it is beneficial, and it is good and advisable to give your employees that time, so to really reflect on what is helping me. Is there, beyond my job, are there other things that are adding to my stress, and where are some levers that I can play with in order to change things up? So yes, this is good on one hand side. Again, I would be mindful about what type of resilience training this is. I would even be cautious of everything, or of everyone who calls something a training, because what we don't have to do is just dump another bunch of tools on people. Every glossy magazine is full with tips about how you have to exercise more and eat healthy and sleep better. And, everybody knows this. What is missing really is the time and the space to pause and to reflect, just like we do in Lean. Just pause and reflect on, what am I actually doing here? What's helping me, tuning into that, and then finding those tailored strategies for yourself and starting to make small changes. So yes to that, but also I agree with you, putting the whole responsibility about, this is just how the workplace is today. Why don't you build up your resilience? I like to compare that to, here, we're giving you a hand to pull you out of the river. You seem to be drowning, but who threw people into the river in the first place?
Right.
So, and that is where that other part comes in, where we really have to think about, is the way that we are structuring work, is the way that we're running this organization, is that helpful to the people? And by the way, if it's helpful to the people, it's also helpful to your bottom line. Yeah. For anyone who hasn't noticed that yet. So it needs those two things, because you can build up your resilience and you can know all the tools, and you can do exercise and healthy nutrition all you want. If you come back every Monday morning to find how do I say that without a curse word? but just to find a total mess. Yeah, and you just have to tidy up behind everyone else. If you have a backlog of how many tasks, if everybody is frustrated because nobody knows who's doing what, and you have conflicting priorities and you have conflicting goals and all of that. I mean, it's a never-ending story. So it's both. And if I may, there's one other thing that I wanted to mention. There will always be times when things are crazy at work. So just think about the current global situation, where there's a war in a country, which triggers all sort of things down the line. So companies having to shift their supply chain. Where do we get material from? Do we have more requests for this type of product, less for that? All sorts of business contingency plans are being activated. So this sends a company and the workload into overdrive. Yeah, and it happens sometimes. What is really, really important, especially on those times, is to pay extra attention to increasing those job resources that I mentioned, that is that other more engaging, more motivating process that is running next to the demands. So things like, do people know where they stand, whether they are doing a good job and what they could do better? Do they get social support at work? Are we helping each other out? Do we have a sense of belonging? Do people have a good level of autonomy and flexibility in how they go about their work and how they get it done? Or is everything, like Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times, where you just do one thing all of the time and you have to stay in the takt with the machine? And so Okay, I'm going to stop talking now.
No, it's okay. You bring up really important points with, it's hard to believe that this has all happened and that we're talking about it with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. That affects, like you said, possibly supply chain and different dynamics. It also affects people. So you mentioned social support, the need to recognize that there's high anxiety levels, even for somebody like me who's halfway around the world from Ukraine. There's that threat hanging over our heads now of this all escalating, and with nuclear powers involved, nobody's out of harm's reach, even though there's so much devastation and killing and harm happening in Ukraine. So that weighs on people's minds, and that may keep us from being at our peak performance. Or somebody who is on our team, or somebody who's part of a Kaizen event, you might say, well, you seem a little, you seem distracted, or, there's that need to focus on how are we doing as people, not just the tasks at hand. It's not really a question, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that need for social support of people.
It is true. The very least you have to do is to acknowledge it and give some space to allow to talk about things if people want to. And sometimes it might feel this is a complete waste of time if, let's say, you have a 30-minute meeting where, because there are still projects running, somehow business continues to go on, and you need to get through a certain amount of things, and you might think that skipping the fluffy blah blah at the beginning gives more airspace to the real important technical topics. However, what I have found is the more time you give people to connect, to feel seen and acknowledged, to feel heard, to be able to voice what's on their mind, and to feel cared for. If you take a genuine interest in how are you doing, hey, you look really tired, or you're not sleeping well right now, if typically it only takes 5, there are days it takes 10 or 15 minutes, but eventually people will feel more relaxed. They feel like, okay, I don't have to hold anything back, I don't have to bottle anything up, which again would take extra energy. And they say, okay, we're all good now, let's focus on those other points that we wanted to discuss, and you still get it all done. So there's absolutely no point in trying to skip over that.
It's I think I appreciate what you said about, at the very least, acknowledge it. It doesn't mean we're going to solve it.
Yes.
But acknowledge it, get some things off your mind, hopefully, or by talking about it a little bit, hopefully provides some relief to then move forward. But I think this makes me think of the concept and the phrase that comes from Toyota, respect for people, or translated as respect for humanity. There's that recognition, that none of us are robots, and we get distracted, we get worried, we get anxious. It's hard to just shut off the outside world sometimes when we come to work, and that could apply to all sorts of different settings where I think it helps to show a little bit of grace, like you said, just even to ask. It seems like you're struggling. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah. And you can look at this from an ethical or moral standpoint, where you could just say other people matter, full stop. And you can look at this even from a scientific standpoint, where research has shown again and again in psychology that when we are worried, when we are in fear, then these are some of our most primal emotions, and they override everything. Nobody who feels like that has access to their human capacity of analytical thinking, of creative problem solving, of being innovative, of being agile in reacting to demands. Everyone who's in that state is literally as good as a lizard, because that's your lizard brain acting. So if you show people you care for them, if you make them feel safe, that triggers a whole other set of, hormones to be released, a whole other, much more, they feel soothed, they feel, like I said, safe. And this makes us calm down, and, a new set of neurons can start to fire and wire up, and you get access back to all of those great cognitive, emotional resources that you have. So, like I said, I'm a scientist. If the data would show that ignoring how people feel and screaming at them if they're not doing well would work, then I might advocate for that. However, it doesn't. It's very clear. It's very clear what works.
Yeah. And when things don't work, I was thinking back a couple of minutes ago when you talked about, sometimes when you see how things are a big mess, and there are times where I feel like cursing because, it's just, you think of how to describe the problem and the chaos that you see in workplaces when there are not well-designed systems and when people aren't being engaged in improvement. Sometimes I don't know any German, but sometimes there's a German word that sort of encapsulates a complex idea. Is there a German word that sort of describes something that is a big bleeping mess, if you will? That whether it's a German curse word or not, I'm just curious how you would say it in German.
I don't have a German word. Yeah. It's I have a word that a British colleague likes to use, but again, I don't want to make this podcast explicit, so I'm not gonna.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the more serious point that you raise, back to the idea of the connection between, if it's good for the team members, if it's good for the employees, it's also good for the bottom line. I believe that. I think many of our listeners would. I think part of the challenge, so you could look at something like freeing up people's time to participate in a Kaizen event. You could view that as a cost, or you could view that as an investment. And I think part of the challenge is the short-term cost of the people's time is known and it's immediate. The benefit might be a prediction, it might be uncertain, it might be down the road. And I think part of the challenge is that even if people see those connections, leaders, I think too often make decisions based on short-term thinking, when the Toyota Way principle number one would encourage us to make decisions based on the long term. I'm curious if you've helped people navigate short-term decision-making versus more long-term decision-making.
That's really the holy grail, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I guess, so that is one aspect. Unfortunately, the short-term always has it has this feel of urgency to it. And we're like really, we're so primed to jump at anything that screams at us. And again, occasionally there might be the case if you have to relocate a production from a factory that you have to close in a country where there's a war into another country or into another factory, then that takes priority, full stop. So you need, that's very clear. However, if that is not the case and you just feel a bit stingy with your time that you want to allow for people to participate in such events, then I always like to so if there's anyone listening who says, man, I really want to see more of that in my company, I'm a huge fan of having a bit of a grassroots approach to that and piloting things, flying under the radar, finding ways, where's no one looking right now? Where can we test this out? Create good results, create our own case studies, if you will, and then bring them back. The most difficult and even also saddest thing, I think, is that you always have to bring results that can be seen on a spreadsheet. It's just most companies, and I apologize if I offend anyone, but they are run by bean counters. Mm-hmm. And if it doesn't show on your spreadsheet as as revenue or as cost, then it doesn't exist. Yeah. Even though things can be measured and even though things have an impact. So let's say you run a Kaizen event and you see on your spreadsheet, what can you literally see? You can see how many hours this was, into how much of salary that translates into, how much other work maybe has piled up. You can also measure down the line the improvement in quality. You can measure that in terms of inventory going down or in cost saved, these kind of things. What is also there, but what doesn't show up on your spreadsheet, is the relational energy that builds up, is the smooth ways of working in day-to-day operations, simply because people now know each other and know how to talk with each other and have a better understanding for each other's perspective and issues. Mm-hmm. What is also there is that learning that people have, because while people might work just on the content bit during the Kaizen event, they also pick up on a meta level how this is done and how to approach these types of things. So now they learned more about their own process. They learned more about how their company functions. They learned more about how to solve problems in a sustainable way. So there's all of that learning and growth, which they take forward and which the company will benefit from. Mm-hmm. On the other hand side, what are you losing out on if you don't do this, which doesn't show up on a spreadsheet? Again, you might have frustration building up because that team doesn't, do their bit, and why do they never deliver, and why do they always complain? And the other team says, well, whenever they want something from me, they never fill in this form that I give them properly. And so there's all of that friction that is there, but it doesn't show up in a spreadsheet. So it's, like you said, it's the short-term versus long-term, but it's also, what do you see in numbers and what else is there that is harmful or beneficial, but that you can't directly measure.
Yeah. Good points. And back to the phrase bean counters, that might bother somebody. It's not explicit, at least, so that's okay. We did use that phrase. This is going back to, I looked up episode 126. Back in 2011, I was able to interview Bob Lutz from the auto industry, pretty legendary guy. And he had a book out called, the title of the book was Car Guys versus Bean Counters. So he was trying to make the case that too many decisions in the automotive industry were being made on purely financial or cost-cutting dimensions to the detriment of product and customer, not just satisfaction, but customer excitement.
Yeah. And look, I'm not suggesting anyone intends to do a bad job.
Right.
It's just how people learned to do business. Mm-hmm. So if you learn to do business in a different way, and there are people around the world who start rethinking on how this works, sometimes with ideas that seem outrageous. The one example that comes to mind is that I think it's an accounting company where the CEO cut his pay and raised every employee's pay to $70K a year.
Was this, I think, Dan Price, I think was his name, at a software, it was a software company, I think.
Yeah, well, a software company. Yeah. So, this sounds outrageous, and how dare he, and this will never work. And, if you're so indoctrinated and if you grew up knowing those traditional ways of managing a company, sometimes it looks like, especially the biggest companies, there's one book, Management 101, and everybody has read this one book and nobody has any new ideas. But, so it's really not your fault. And also, if you have a massive company to run, then you need to be very measured in the risks you take, because you have a lot of people to answer to. And, many things can go wrong.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not suggesting that everybody intends to do a bad job. I just wish we could have a bit more of a cultural change.
Well, there's that book, the idea of a Management 101 book. There's also MBA education. I have an MBA. You have a PhD in chemistry. Do you have an MBA degree?
No, I know nothing about economics.
well, and it's not even so much economics, but the idea of you're not burdened by kind of the typical business practices and mindsets that might be taught in an MBA program. So sometimes people, I think, similar to what you were saying, we can't fault people for what they've been taught, for what's been modeled or demonstrated to them. It's difficult to unlearn things.
Yes.
Like it's almost easier to start your career at a company that can teach you the lean management style from the beginning. But then you don't have the context of trying to change the culture. So and it is really difficult for people, for leaders, for organizations to put behind old habits from decades of experience. But Nicole, I also wanted to ask you, I know you can share some examples of some process improvements that you've done in different professional settings, or at least if there's something that you could share with us.
Yeah. One small one was when I did my green belt project. This was about a process. So it's a company internal process within the science area. And, as scientists, you regularly publish peer-reviewed papers in scientific journals. So when you submit this on behalf of a company, before you can submit it to the paper or to the journal, you would need to approve it and align it internally to make sure, first of all, it meets the company standards. Second of all, to make sure that everything you want to publish, you can publish, because you don't want to, spill out any trade secrets or anything like that. And so that internal process would involve a review committee. And so whoever submitted a paper would have to send it to a number of people. And then, you probably know the tool of a handoff diagram. So for everybody who doesn't know that, is you can draw a circle and you can just put the names of everyone involved in getting this done around the circle. And then I took the time for one submission to follow the paper trail. And I would just draw lines between which people, and it was a complete spider web, or not even that structured, it was just like lines and lines and lines and lines. So there was just so much email ping pong. Deadlines were missed. You had to remind people multiple times, all of these kind of things. So it just wasn't very efficient. And the scientists who wanted to get the paper out were very frustrated about it. And that was one thing that we looked at in terms of, okay, let's map out the process. What steps are we following? Which ones are useful? Are they in the right order, or should we organize that differently? And then, so again, because it was a green belt project, the point for me was more to learn to apply the methodology well and to work with a team on that, rather than have 1 million in savings. So that was one thing. Or another thing would be having a finance process when, with the so once a year at fiscal year end, there's a ton of accounting to do and getting the books straight. And that is a necessary work. But that team had a problem, because then every year, and that was around summertime, they could bet on spending 1 or 2 or even 3 weekends working and getting this all done. And so we, together with the team, we looked at, well, what's happening here? Where's all that work coming from? And does it really have to be like this? And so one of the main causes of this work was that the input data that they were getting wasn't clean, as in there were items in there that they worked with that just didn't have to be there. And so they could have been cleaned out by the person in the previous step. of the process, and that already reduced the workload, and gaining more visibility of certain things and access to other information and data. So it's sometimes I think about, man, maybe sometimes we don't even need lean tools. We just need to put people in a room and get them talking.
That is a huge part of it. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And those sound like examples of improvements that had benefit to the business, benefit to the people doing the work. And these things can't always be described clearly in terms of dollars and ROI. Sometimes they're just things that are worthwhile doing. And maybe there's an indirect effect where, let's say, maybe these people who are publishing research and publishing journals, if they're happier, maybe they're more likely to stay with the company. And that has a financial benefit, but it's different than saying we reduced material spend by $400,000 by making a redesign to the product. Like that might be very easily, clearly measured of the cause and effect, but that's not always the case. So one other thing I want to talk about, Nicole, before we wrap up is you mentioned earlier when there's stress, unclear roles and responsibilities are often a cause, if maybe even getting closer to a root cause. So I wonder if you can share some of the lessons that you've learned about recognizing that problem and making things better.
Yeah. So collaborating well with others is a challenge sometimes, especially if you speak different languages, not in terms of literal language, but just in terms of how your brains work and what your normal task is about. So for me as a scientist working in product innovation and being very, technical, still creative, but also technical about how the formula works and how it interacts with the packaging and how it's made and what flavors to select and all of that. And then if you work with the marketing department, who are in a completely different sphere and who couldn't care less about viscosity, and it's very natural. So that is one way where we need to collaborate well, but especially when it comes to roles and responsibilities. So one thing that was a confusion for me was back in, like I said, in product innovation. So we had the innovation team, who were making the prototypes in order to say, okay, here now, this is our product. Here's our specification that we intend for that, and then hand it over to the realization or manufacturing department to make it. And because that team that I was working in was young and it was first emerging, both teams, they weren't existing before, so there were no established processes, there were no established handover points, and that was at times, especially when the deadline approached, that was at times really frustrating to if certain raw materials had to be ordered from a supplier, certain ingredients, and because, I in the lab, I would only need sample sizes. I would get them for free from the supplier. But then in order to run production, you would need a lot more of them, or a lot more of that ingredient. And then, so who's placing that order? So far, this was quote unquote my supplier. So are you going to send an order? Have you ordered it? The lead time is 4 weeks to get that ingredient. We want to run production trials in 3 weeks. So why haven't you placed the order? And, this sounds silly, but if that adds up for multiple different things, and at best you have confusion and frustration because work isn't getting done and you're not clear. At worst, you start getting turf wars because people are encroaching on each other's quote unquote territory. So getting really clear on what will you do, what will I do, and how do we contribute to each other's work to enable each other is so important.
It is. It's very important, and I think to summarize some of the things you've been talking about, and we've talked about in this episode, is taking action to reduce chaos means breaking down silos and creating clarity. Among other things, that leads to less stress, less burnout, which then flows through to benefits to the bottom line. That's my summary of it. Anything else you would add to the summary of all of the points here today?
No, just that other people matter. And
yes,
I guess this is the main guiding point for me, always, to also, when things get heated, to not lash out or blame anyone, and just know we're all in the same boat and we're all here trying to do our best.
Yeah, to get beyond ourselves to thinking about others. Yes. Well, Nicole has a download that we'll be able to share. This will be in the show notes. How to reduce stress and burnout in your team. Very important topic, and we'll encourage people to go look for that. So thank you for offering that up. Nicole, is there anything else that you would want to say about that download?
Yeah, well, I call it a no fluff, immediately applicable guide. So, oftentimes when we get downloads on the internet, they're very, very shallow and very generic. This one isn't. I put a ton of effort into creating it. It has self-assessments you can do as to drill down and understand what are the factors that contribute maybe to stress, and how am I set up in my team to with the factors that cause or help motivation and engagement, and practical strategies and tips on how you can start working on them. So really encourage everyone to download it.
Yeah, well, thank you for offering that. Again, our guest today has been Dr. Nicole Tschierske. Her podcast, again, is called Better Work. That's probably a better title than calling the podcast No Fluff.
Yeah.
It's a no fluff podcast, though, right?
It is.
So thank you again for having me as the first guest there, and encourage people to check that out. Better Work. And again, Nicole's website, I'll link to this in the show notes, NicoleTschierske.com. So Nicole, thank you for being here today. I'll say thank you. I guess I'll say cheers with my coffee mug, and cheers to you. Your weekend starts now. Huh?
Yeah. Thank you for having me, Mark. This was fun.
Yeah, it was. Thank you.